Hey everyone. Um, Sorry about missing the lecture today. I'm going to try to go through this as quickly as I can, and have you watch this prior to us meeting on Thursday so that we can go through and answer any and all questions. So I did put together a sheet, well, it's actually 10 pages of these notes that you can follow along. Um, However you want to do this, this is completely up to you. But this is one of those topics that I have told you that you have to have in a government class, especially during an election year. You should know what is actually going on. Now, some of this stuff we've probably talked about um, in terms of the presidential election, the differences between caucuses and primaries, and I'm just going to cover those or remind us on those briefly here in just a second. But in teaching the Electoral College over these years, one of the things I've learned very quickly is that it is confusing, but if I teach it in terms of like a relay race, um, for some reason, this seems to connect with kids and they seem to understand this process a little bit better. And so this particular grouping of dates, these are the laps. This is the process of lapping in this election season. Let me see if I can find, that's not going to give it to me. Um, yeah, I guess the only thing I can do is just check marks lap one. Um, this is technically all lap one. Um, and then we move into lap two, but I'm going to go through these with you. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to start talking about what is the first thing. And we talked about presidents having to be mentioned, getting their names known. That's the most important thing. Going into this 2020 election, the two top contenders, their names are known, so they're not fighting that battle as much. In the 2008 election, Barack Obama was a new name, so they that was one of the things the Democrats had to do was get that name known out there. But lap one is really going through the caucus and the primary season. Remember, a caucus is the meetings and the primary is the election. Um, and what we know about the caucuses and the primaries is that it's same party versus same party. The Republicans didn't have that big of a fight because the candidates that were running against Trump for the Democrat, or excuse me, the Republican nomination, they kind of fell by the wayside because he has such a strong Republican support. We followed and watched the Democrats. Bernie Sanders has since dropped out. And I think the main current event today was that Hillary Clinton is endorsing Joe Biden as well. So, again, when we go through this, oh, wrong thing. When we go through this, we look at the primaries, it's party against party, and they're fighting against each other. That takes us up to the convention. The conventions are going to be really kind of a new, it's going to be a new process this year going into the conventions as they're trying to figure out what they're actually going to do. But once we get to the national conventions and the formal nomination is made for both the Democrat and the Republican, then we go from party versus same party to actually the Democrats versus the Republicans. And so, again, I know there's been some changes, but the question is, I think it's the Democrat. I'll have to look. They've moved their national convention back, um, and I honestly don't know what's going to happen to these conventions as they move forward. So, um, we'll have to just kind of keep an eye on that. So once they go to the national convention and the formal nomination is made for the two top candidates, then it becomes again this fight here, and I think that fight has already started. And once that formal nomination is made, then we move into the second lap. So our caucuses, primaries, and national convention are all lap one. And then what happens between post-convention and the general election actually is lap two. So after the election, we go to the general election, and that's where we'll go to the polls and we will select. Technically, we're not selecting the president. We're selecting a slate of electors, but I'm going to get into that a little bit here in just a second. So the next general election is coming up, and if you're following national politics, President Trump is definitely dropping that date quite a bit lately. So once the general election is finished in November, then it's off to lap three where we actually get into the Electoral College. Now, this is where stuff gets a little confusing. And I sometimes think teaching the Electoral College does look like this cartoon. And I've tried to find this cartoon, but I've tried to go, okay, if we're at here, we follow back out here, we hit a dead end here. If we go in, we can get, well, maybe we can get, but I don't know. That's how the Electoral College feels to me. The first thing I want to point out is that the Electoral College, as some people still wonder, is not an actual place. It's a constitutional institution. I know I have that sweatshirt in the front of my room. I had that sweatshirt specially made that says Electoral College, established 1787. And sometimes when I wear it in school in years past, people have asked me if that's an actual place, and I just have to shake my head and just go, yes, and I graduated from there. So when we look at what is the Electoral College, this is something the framers created. They were very worried about the average citizen being smart enough to choose their chief executive. In fact, the framers kind of thought about what kind of chief executive or executive they wanted. They had pondered the idea of having a council of electors, so a group of them. They processed the idea of having regional executives or category executives, one dealing with different topics that might be facing us as a country, but what they finally came down to is this Electoral College, and this is a group of people. Very simply, it's a body of people who represent the states, and they formally cast the vote for president and vice president. So within the checks and balance process, how the president can check on the House and Senate, and the Senate and the House can check on the president and the courts, the Electoral College is actually and technically a check on what the people are deciding. And I kind of messed that up, but here we go. So I'm going to have you watch a couple things, a couple videos before Thursday's lecture. The question really does come down to, why do we need an Electoral College? Because as I previously stated, the framers literally said the population choosing the chief executive is going to be pressured by special interests, and they can get pulled based on these interests to actually supporting someone who may not be the best candidate out there. And so the Electoral College, as I've stated, becomes a check on that process. This is one of the videos I'm going to have you watch, is as we've done the Schoolhouse Rocks. Schoolhouse Rock, many years later, after I'm Just a Bill, actually came back and recreated the video for the Electoral College. So I'll link that for you to watch as well. Doing some background to the original Electoral College. In Article 2, when we go back, and some of you, if you remember, we did that that constitutional search activity where you had to go in and correct an incorrect statement that I gave you. And some of you noticed that there were parts of the Constitution that were, when you're reading it, it says changed later. Well, the original Constitution in Article 2 said this, and it was very simple. I mean, I really think the framers had an idea there, but they made it very, very simple. They said the person with the greatest number of votes In the Electoral College is the president, and the person with the second is the vice president. So whoever gets the most electoral votes becomes our president, and whoever comes in second actually is the vice president. Very simple process. And as we've talked about, it works great. Um, it actually is a system that took care of itself, but it takes care of itself when the person who they've chosen was actually almost predetermined before they even had an election. But the problem with this is that the Electoral College only worked for Washington. Um, and there's some reasons for this. When he was getting towards the end of his second term, he was making it pretty clear to people that he was not interested in a third term. And asked why he didn't want to go into a third term, the rationale for that was is if he continues to be elected to this position, we're shifting into a monarchy system, which is what we really did want to get away from. And he noticed something being created or building itself, I guess you could say, these political parties, and he wanted nothing to do with them. Now, if you look at a textbook's going to say he was part of the Federalist Party. That is, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans become our first political parties. But if you really know anything about Washington, you would know that he was a Federalist because he supported the ratification of the Constitution, not because he was a part of this group that wanted to influence the political outcomes of the United States. And so he, even in his farewell address, he actually says to them, political parties are going to be the downfall of this country, and he warned of these factions and these problems that political parties were going to create if we allowed them to continue. So we go into the election of 1796 once Washington says he won't run for a third term, and we see that we've got a competition here. These two did not like each other. It was very known that they did not like each other, and so when we go and look at what was the outcome, um, oddly and kind of crazy to think about, especially in today's terms, but they ended up with a president and a vice president who disliked each other. And I don't necessarily say that's so odd because if we look at Kennedy and Johnson, they weren't exactly the best of friends either. Um, but here was the first problem with the Electoral College, is that when you go first and second place, the person with the most votes becomes president and the person with the second most votes becomes vice president. You end up with two individuals who have competing interests, and that's going to cause problems. And so when John Adams becomes president, Thomas Jefferson is actually quoted as saying the vice president position was the loneliest job he'd ever had because John Adams failed to give him very many responsibilities, and so he just kind of was there. So by the time we get to the election of 1800, John Adams is running for his second term in office. The Democratic Republicans have this figured out, and by and large, they figured out that they had to work the system and they had to work those numbers. And so in doing so, it was slated that and understood that Jefferson was supposed to become the president and Aaron Burr would be his number two. But Aaron Burr started to realize that he actually the um, he had votes and people were supporting him. And so aside from Jefferson, he actually thought that he could win the presidency. And so when the election of 1800 comes up, we find out that it was supposed to be Jefferson with more electoral votes than Burr and Adams, and it ends up in a tie. That party did achieve what it set out to do by defeating the Federalist Party, which is pretty much, I mean, they hang on for a little bit, but not much for any more presidential positions. But then the Democratic Republican Party now has a problem because we don't have a first and second winner. So the election then goes to the House of Representatives, and they vote over 30 times to see if they couldn't break the tie. And finally, the one who breaks the tie and gives the information or makes the final decision is Hamilton. And Hamilton, as anybody who followed that Broadway production knew, that Hamilton actually looked up to Aaron Burr, wanted to be like Aaron Burr, and became friends with Aaron Burr, and then they became enemies. And in the end, Hamilton decides that Jefferson should become the president and Burr would become his number two. And because of that, Burr is so angry that he lost this position that eventually Hamilton and him end up in a duel. And Aaron Burr ends up killing Hamilton. So the history is kind of fun on that part. But what this does is reminds us the election of 1796 and the election of 1800. The United States has had 4 elections up to this point: 2 for Washington, 1 for Adams that he won, and then this 4th election where there's a tie. So that means that there were no problems with the 2 with Washington. And then the next 2 presidential elections, there were problems. And so 50% of the presidential elections in the United States, in this new country, had issues. And so it was very clear that there needed to be some changes to the Article 2. And so they went back to Article 2 and they looked at the idea of this first and second place being the issue. And so they said, we need to get rid of this. And how do we get rid of this is in the Electoral College, not in the general election. And I want to make sure that point is made. This is not the general election. This is the Electoral College. When the electors convene to cast the official ballots for president and vice president, each elector actually gets 2 ballots. One is for president, and a second ballot is given to them, and the second ballot is the vice president. So each elector actually votes twice. And the next thing that they changed was this idea that they got rid of what we know as plurality. Plurality is the idea of whoever wins the most wins. They got rid of that. They got rid of the idea of plurality to win a presidential election, and actually said, in order to become president of the United States, without extra steps, and I can talk about those in a second here, you need a majority to win, and that's 1 vote over 50%. There is one more change in the amendments dealing with the Electoral College, and we have talked about that. That was in the 50s, where the District of Columbia said there's no representation in the Electoral College for them, even though the President of the United States lives in that district. And this is the one where the 23rd Amendment comes in and says the District of Columbia will have representation equal to the smallest state, which right now is Wyoming. And so DC will always have 3 electoral votes because it's equal to the smallest state. But I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. Okay. The next thing I just want to touch base on is we keep talking about these electors. Who are these electors? The picture you're seeing here is from the 2016 Electoral College election in the state of Minnesota. Electors are eligible voters. I could be an eligible voter, or I am an eligible voter. So that means I could actually be an elector for the state of Minnesota. This is the one that kind of kicks me out because I am not an active member of any political party. And all of these 10 electors representing Minnesota are active Democrats. And I'll explain why they're Democrats and not Republicans. In Minnesota, each state can decide this, but in Minnesota, the electors are chosen by their party. And what's unique about how Minnesota does it is we have, excuse me, 8 congressional districts. And so we have an elector who represents each district. And so we have the 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And then we have 2 what we call at-large representatives. A lot of times I've had students say, well, does this person get paid? No, this is like the highest elective position available. I mean, you are carrying out a constitutional position. It is very big deal. Um, but the one major sticking point on this, and I want to make sure we understand that these 10 people in this picture, they are not office holders. There cannot be a conflict of interest. So nobody in this line holds a public office in which they would be conflicted having to make this decision. The other thing that's not on here that I think is really important to understand is that the electors' votes are public, and when they cast those votes, they are read out loud. And how I had this picture was because I had the opportunity in the 2016 presidential election. The Secretary of State sent out an email to teachers and said, would you be interested in coming and watching the Electoral College vote? And of course, I jumped all over that idea, and they allowed us to bring 3 students to watch the process. And it was an experience. I will do it again. I think it's a fascinating process to see the Constitution carried out. But I'm going to come back to this one when we start talking a little bit more about this. What I'm doing right now is I'm putting pieces together. To get the pieces in the puzzle, I have to just put a whole bunch of things out there. So I throw out why we have the Electoral College, why and how there were some changes that were made, who are the electors. Now the question I have is, how are these Electoral College numbers apportioned? And it's very simple. It takes the number of representatives a state has and adds their 2 senators, and that's the total Electoral College, how the representation takes place. So if we look at Minnesota, Minnesota has 8 representatives. We have our 2 senators, oh, excuse me, well, can't even type there. That just means that Minnesota has the 10 electoral college votes. California has, I'm going to get this wrong, 53 members of the U.S. House, and they have the 2 senators, and so they have 55 electoral college votes. We've talked about Wyoming. Wyoming has 1 House member. They have 2 senators because every state has 2 senators. So there's their 3 electoral college votes. Now, keeping in mind, as I jumped a slide here, keeping in mind that it's important, this is where the census becomes one of those big issues, is because our number of House of Representatives, how many people we have in the House, is based on our census results. And so that's why there's such a big kick and push to get those census results in, because that changes not only how many representatives we have, but it also changes how we are represented in the Electoral College. And so we start looking at this issue of Minnesota having 10 electoral college votes, and we can see it's kind of hard to see in this image, but these light yellow ones are the ones with the 3 and the 4. So we've got a whole chunk of states here that have 3 or 4 electoral college votes, and then we get to these big states when they have the high number of electoral college votes. So then the question is, does that mean that big states are better represented? And I think if you stopped and you just thought about that question, some of you would actually say, yes, of course, California has more, they have 55, so they have more say in the Electoral College. But what you need to consider is what is the proportion. And so to understand this, you take the population. Now, keep in mind, one of the things I think it's important to remember is this is based on the 2010 census results. These are still the numbers from the 2010 census, excuse me, not sentence. And so we take Minnesota's population of 5.2 million and divide it by the 10 electoral college votes we have, and we find out that we have one electoral college vote for every, I apologize, for every electoral college vote we have, that represents about 500,000 people. So if we fast forward and start looking at this, we find out that actually the people in California are not, well, I suppose it would, by proportion, they're about almost 160, maybe even a little bit more people per electoral college vote, because their population, according to the 2010 census, was 36.7 million. They have 55 electoral college votes, but each electoral college vote is representing almost 700,000 people. So actually the people in Minnesota have better representation. Now take a look at Wyoming. Just peek at that number. They have 3 electoral college votes, and their population, according to the 2010 census, was 532,000. So we divide that into the 3 electoral college votes, and for every 177,000 people, they have an electoral college vote. That's quite a discrepancy when it comes to California. So there is argument that the proportion, or how the electoral college votes are distributed or apportioned to the states, has to be revisited. But here's even the bigger kicker. We're looking at the District of Columbia. They have a population that's actually higher than Wyoming, but they have their people are actually higher represented in the electoral college than that of many states. So that's caused some disagreement among the states, that the way we apportion electoral college votes is still an issue. Now, how do we get the national equation? Okay, so how do we figure out this is the total number of electoral college votes right now in the United States. So how does that number come to be? Well, you've got the 100 senators. Every state has the 2. Not something we need to discuss. I think that's just understood. We have the 435 members of the U.S. House of Representatives, and then we have those 3 votes to the District of Columbia, which is where we get the 538 votes. Now, the one thing we also pointed out, or I also pointed out, is that in order to win now, based on the 12th Amendment, is that to win the president, you need to have a majority, which is the 50% plus 1. And so if we look at the 538, half of those is 269 plus the 1 that makes it a majority. So that's where this number 270 comes in. And so honestly, I think if you'd asked any of the candidates when they were the Democratic candidates, when they were running for the nomination, again, if you asked them what their favorite number was, I'm pretty certain you would have gotten the 270, because that's what's needed to win. And remember, the 12th Amendment made to win the presidential election is now based on a majority. What it used to be was plurality. And again, plurality was whoever wins the most wins the election. And I think this is a great visual to help us remember what that actually means. And so in the 1998 gubernatorial, there's my favorite word again, election for governor, 37%, I think we can safely say 37% of the Minnesota population voted for Jesse Ventura. And we look at the Republican and the Democrat who were running against Jesse Ventura. And as weird as this is, and I think this was an election that holds the history, 63% of Minnesotans did not want Jesse Ventura to win that election. But because we're based on whoever wins the most in a gubernatorial election, 63% may have said that's not their choice, but because it's simply whoever wins the most becomes or becomes the winner, that's how we got that person for governor. So if we look at the 2016 election, all that was needed to win the election, remember, is 270. And when he says he won that election fair and square, it's true. He absolutely won that election. I'll talk about this little crazy thing up here in just a second. So when we look at the popular vote, though, um, the popular vote, she won. Um, and we go back and say, well, how did she win the popular vote, but she did not win the Electoral College? The states that Clinton won had really high turnout. So when we look at Minnesota, if we had a turnout of 30% and she still won more in Minnesota, she would have still won Minnesota. But Minnesota had a turnout of almost 70% in that election. So the our votes, how many of us vote, is actually calculated, but it doesn't improve or give her more electoral votes regardless of what the turnout is. So we look at some other presidential elections. There's some crazy elections when we start looking at um, the when we look at the popular vote versus the electoral. This was probably one of the closest elections in presidential history, but this one was one that they thought we got to wait and to see how the electoral votes actually come in. So all right, I just want to give you a second here to process all that we've been through. I know that this is a lot of slides. I know this is a lot of information going through, and I'm just going to try to move this. Probably won't be successful, but I'm going to try and just show you the amount of slides we have actually gone through. That's a lot of information. Um, and I'm just going to start shifting in and hopefully try to put some of these pieces together here. Oh yeah, now I go and lose this. Now I have to find this. Okay, this is, okay, so I think I've got this back on the way it should be. So I'm going to try to put the pieces together. I know this is starting to look like a puzzle and you got all these different pieces here. Hopefully as I put this together, this will start making sense. All right, so we look at how does the United States, or how do the individual states, how do they allocate their electoral college votes? How do they decide who wins their votes? Okay, so we asked this question, how does each state make that decision? How are they going to make sure that the candidates win and it's fair and square? Well, when we look at the individual states, 48 states use what is called a winner-takes-all system. And I'm going to go through a couple examples here with you. What the winner-takes-all system says is that whoever wins plurality in the general election, and I'm going to throw the general election right here, if I can get this to work. My God, this is becoming a problem. In the general election, so whoever wins the most votes on November 3rd in the 48 states, they get all of that state's electoral college votes. So it literally is a simple process. If you win more votes on November 3rd versus your candidate, you get all that state's electoral college votes. Okay, so let's take a peek. Let's look at Minnesota from 2016. It was a close election. Minnesota is not the strong Democratic state it used to be. So when we look at this, we look and say, okay, so who won more? It doesn't matter if they win one more or a million more. It's just who wins more. So whoever wins more wins all of this. So to get Minnesota's electoral votes, again, the process is you add up how many senators they have and how many representatives. Minnesota has 10. And so we say whoever wins more wins them all. So in this particular case, Clinton won 10. And based on the winner takes all system, Trump wins 0. Okay. Looking at California. California is quite a crazy state. We add these up. We know that they have 55 electoral college votes. Whoever wins more wins them all, and the other candidates get 0. Okay, so it is a simple process. We look at Texas. Okay, Texas has a total of 38 electoral college votes. We look at who won more. Whoever wins more gets them all, and the opponent gets 0. Okay, so that's how 48 states do this. Okay, and if we can get to the number of 270, that means they've won more than the other candidate, and they've won one more over half, which means there's no way the other candidate can win. 2 states, on the other hand, use a little different system. Some would argue that this system is better. It's more representative of the people. I've heard all the arguments. I have opinions, but that's not what we're looking at quite yet. So the district method is very much like the winner takes all system. So it is saying whichever candidate receives plurality of the November 3rd election will win that congressional district. Now remember, we're divided into congressional districts. So instead of looking at the state as a whole, they look at each district and they say, okay, this district, who won more? We're going to give them that one vote. And then they say whichever candidate wins more districts will get those extra 2, because remember, senators don't have districts. Senators are what we call at large. They represent the entire state. So looking at Maine from the 2016 election, Maine has 4 electoral votes. And we have to look at, in this situation, they have 2 districts. They've got this northern district and they have this southern district. So Clinton won more votes in that southern district. So she gets, if I can get this to work, she gets, I hate this computer. Okay, I'm going to use a pen now. Because she won that district, she wins 1. Because he won that second district, he gets 1 as well. Well, they've got 4 electoral college votes. So how do we decide who gets the extra 2? We look at the popular vote, and whoever won the popular vote will then get those extra 2. And so Clinton actually won 3 electoral college votes in Maine, and Trump won that single one. So 2 states used that system in 2008. McCain won 2 votes in Nebraska, 2 districts in Nebraska. Obama won 1. And so because they have 3 districts plus the 2, McCain actually took 4 of Nebraska's electoral college votes, and Obama got 1. But in this last election, all 3 districts went to Trump. So what exactly are we doing then on the election day? So this is where I'm going to start to put the pieces together. Remember, the general election this year is November 3rd. So what are we actually doing on November 3rd? We know we're not directly voting for the President of the United States. Our vote is not direct to who wins. What our vote is to determine, do we want, which slate of electors, which group of the electors do we want to vote and represent Minnesota in the Electoral College vote. So prior to November 3rd, in every state, the Democrats and the Republicans in every state are going to select electors. Okay, Minnesota, I'm just using Minnesota as the example. Here's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There are 10 electors for the Democrats and there are 10 electors for the Republicans. We go vote on November 3rd. Okay, and what we're deciding is when we vote and based on which candidates. So if I go vote on November 3rd and I vote a Republican, what I'm actually doing is I'm saying, I want this group of electors. My vote is saying I want that group of electors to cast the official ballots in the Electoral College. So I am actually saying by my vote, I put my ballot in the box and I am determining, do I want the Republicans or the Democrats to vote and represent Minnesota in the Electoral College? This is where people get confused. On November 3rd of this, in a couple months, you are not electing Biden or Trump. You are actually deciding, do I want the Democratic or the Republican electors to represent me when Minnesota and the rest of the states convene to cast the constitutional ballots for President of the United States. So if I vote for Biden, I'm choosing the Democratic electors. If I vote for Trump, I'm saying I want the Republican electors to represent my state in the Electoral College. Okay. I'm going to let that sit for just a second. Okay. So we're going to do these laps again a little bit. We're still, honestly, remember, we're still in lap 3. Lap 1 was the primaries and the caucuses and the conventions. Lap 2 was the general election. Lap 3 is the Electoral College. And then lap 4, we haven't gotten there yet. So remember, when we start talking about the party convention is, this is the end of lap 1. Oops, lap 1. The general election is, if I can get this to work, this is lap 2. Okay, so lap 2 is the general election. So I vote, but what I'm actually voting for is I am voting, oh, and this computer's really getting me ticked off. What I'm actually doing is I am choosing my slate of electors. Do I want the Democrats or the Republicans to vote for me, or excuse me, oh, that was a slip of the tongue, vote for the Democrat or the Republican candidate in the Electoral College. So there's November 3rd. Then the electors, whoever won more on November 3rd, is the group of electors that will go to their individual state capitals and they will cast 2 ballots. And as I pointed out before, one of the ballots is for president and the other is for vice president. So they each get 2, so we don't have a situation where we have a president from one party and a vice president from another. This date is already set, that on December 15th, 2020, it's a Monday, in all 50 states plus the District of Columbia, electors, based on how many senators and representatives the state has, are going to go to their state capital and they're going to vote for president and vice president. Okay? Those ballots are then sent to the District of Columbia, where they are counted in the Senate chamber by the Vice President of the United States. Now, I want you to think about this. If Trump does not win re-election and he has chosen Pence as his running mate, Pence could realistically have to count the Electoral College ballots to confirm the defeat of the Republican candidate, which is what ended up happening in the 2000 election. But that election is a little different because the person running for president was Al Gore, and he happened to be Clinton's vice president at the time, so he ended up counting the ballots to confirm that George Bush defeated him in the presidential election. Okay, so they are counted in open chambers, they're read aloud, so it's very, very public, and then we go to lap 4. Lap 4 is the inauguration. Okay, so the inauguration of the president is something we've already talked about. Okay, we talked about the lame duck period and how it used to be March 4th is when a president was inaugurated. It actually got backed up by about 6 weeks, and we know that the president's term ends at noon on the 20th day of January, which means the new president takes over. Okay, so January 20th, it's a Wednesday next year, at noon, Trump's term ends. Now, if he wins re-election, his second term will start. If he loses in November, then if it's Biden, then Biden's term starts. And as I've said before, it is not the oath, and I'm going to put that big slash through it. It's not the oath that transitions power. It is time that transitions power. Okay, so that's lap 4. We've watched these where John Roberts switches some of the words in Obama's 2009 inauguration, which caused him to go back the second day and repeat it. But I'm taking you back to these dates that we started with at the beginning. Okay, February 3rd was Iowa, the Iowa caucuses. Okay, February 11th was the New Hampshire primaries. March 3rd was Super Tuesday, in which some of you actually went and voted. July is when the Democratic Party will hold the national convention. August, the dates, was the RNC, the Republican National Convention. November 3rd is the date of the general. You can tell I'm tired. You can tell I'm very tired. I quit. You know what I mean. I literally can't do this anymore. Is the general election. December 15th is the Electoral College election. January 4th is the counting of Electoral College ballots. And on January 20th, and I should put it noon, is the inauguration of whomever wins that election. And so as we're looking at this again, and I just want to make sure we point this out. If we look at February, these first dates all the way up to August, this is all lap 1. Lap 2 is the general election. Lap 3 is dealing with the Electoral College, and lap 4 is the inauguration of the president. This is not a short process. And one of the reasons, and I'm going to go back to this because I know some of you are looking and saying this district method. Why do more states not use the district method if it is a better representation of a smaller group of people? Well, this will take us back to this map. The only states that use the winner takes all method are Nebraska and Maine. That is a total of, let me process this here. That is a total of 3-4 electoral college votes. If we did the district method in every state, there would be 435 districts in which candidates would campaign. Right now, we have 50 states that they're campaigning in, and we're looking at a calendar that looks like this. If we went and did the district method in every state, think about this. How long would campaigns last? If they had to campaign to 435 individual districts. Okay, just to let you process that. Okay, so I am hoping that this made some sense. I would strongly suggest, if you have questions after listening to and following through this lecture, you have those questions ready for Thursday's lecture. Okay, so there's no quiz to go with this because Thursday will be a follow-up to this lecture, and we'll just be spending the time making sure that we understand the Electoral College. Have a great afternoon, morning, evening, whatever it is, and whatever time you're watching this. Make it great.